So there's a lot of speculation right now as to how exactly the MCU is going to introduce the idea of mutants into the Marvel Universe. The first big one has already happened in the Marvel Universe, is the Thanos snap. Thanos snapped the gauntlet and radiated cosmic energy out from the point in Africa in Wakanda when he activated the gauntlet. That wave of energy could be used to explain activating the mutant gene in the dormant human population. I guess there's some Wakanda files, or MCU put out some kind of book or content that I saw getting shared around a lot online that talked about how Loki's scepter drew the powers that Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver had inherently out of them, is that activated these latent mutant abilities in them. Thanos' gauntlet, the Infinity Gauntlet, likewise could have had the similar effect on the worldwide population. That's kind of really the first, maybe easiest way for Marvel to explain where mutants come from. The second opportunity is an idea I talked about in one of our previous videos, was the idea that Scarlet Witch could introduce mutants to the MCU in the WandaVision show, is that we could see Scarlet Witch utter a phrase that's very famous in comics, but have it have the opposite effect as it did in the comics. In the comics, they did this storyline where Scarlet Witch kind of lost control of her reality warping powers and reorganized the world powers, and essentially made mutants the dominant species on the planet, subjugating a lower class of humans. At the culmination of that book, at the big fight at the end, she utters the words, "No more mutants," and decimates the mutant population. This had ramifications for the X-Men books for decades after that storyline. The MCU has a habit of reversing things or flipping things or taking things and twisting them a little bit, so we don't quite know what to expect. It's possible sometime in this series, WandaVision, she could utter the words "more mutants" and thereby alter reality to create essentially a second race of mutants in the Marvel Universe. That's probably a bit of a long shot because it's a little bit out there, but it's certainly a possibility. The last instance is the most obvious, and it's the one that is hopefully most likely what we'll get, is that the mutants will just start developing and populating throughout the world as they did in the comics. There is no great origin for mutants in comics. In the initial run of the comics, Stan Lee was still trying to tie all the mutants' origins to radiation somehow. Professor X's parents were radioactive scientists, Sunfire's parents. His mom was pregnant with him during, I can't remember if it was Hiroshima or Nagasaki. She was in one of the blasts, survived, and that exposure to radiation granted her son mutant powers when he was born. So there was an effort to tie it into radiation, which was a trope in the 60s with Stan Lee specifically, trying to explain all the different powers. That was quickly kind of abandoned, and they got to the idea that mutants are just the next step in human evolution, and you're born that way, and your powers are typically activated sometime in puberty. That idea can easily be replicated in the Marvel Universe, and we could just see mutants introduced that way. They're just springing up because we've reached the next stage in human evolution. I don't know exactly how they're going to introduce the mutants to the MCU. Nobody does. Maybe Kevin Feige has an idea. It's important that they haven't announced anything yet. That could be a bit of a red herring from Disney. They just had this big meeting where they announced a whole slew of new MCU content. Essentially, we're getting half as much content has been announced as we've already seen from Marvel. If you look at the timeline and the different shows and movies they have in production, we're getting a huge amount of content. Nowhere in any of that content have they announced any X-Men properties. Marvel had acquired the rights to both the X-Men and the Fantastic Four, which are kind of their two big pillars that they were missing. They announced Fantastic Four, so we do know that's coming. X-Men hasn't been announced yet. They've recently wrapped up a couple X-Men projects over at Fox, notably New Mutants and the second attempt by Fox to make a compelling Dark Phoenix movie. Marvel not announcing it doesn't mean that things aren't in the works. We saw this with The Mandalorian. Spoilers for The Mandalorian. If you haven't seen it, I'd stop watching this video and go watch that. It's much better than this content. But in The Mandalorian, when that second season ended, they had teased a Boba Fett show that was not announced during Disney's announcement of all the other content they were creating. So it's possible there may be some kind of teaser or spoiler coming up in WandaVision that introduces mutants to the Marvel Universe, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, that Disney hasn't announced yet because it would essentially spoil a show that hasn't premiered yet, at least at the time of this recording. So it's entirely possible that we will see something in WandaVision that hints at where mutants are going to enter the Marvel Marvel Universe. We just don't know it yet, and they haven't announced it because they're trying to keep it under wraps. It's hard to gauge where they're going to go. I'm excited to, and I think a big reason where we haven't seen any announcements or why there haven't been much of a hint as to where they're going is it's X-Men still pretty fresh in everyone's minds because those Fox movies just ended a couple years ago. Kevin Feige's probably going to want to build some buffer in between what the MCU is doing with the X-Men, so the general, wider, broader audiences that are enjoying these films and TV shows aren't confusing that with what's come before that Fox has done with the Hugh Jackman X-Men movies. Biggest mistake Fox made, I think, was leaning too heavily into Wolverine. Wolverine's great. We all love Wolverine. But the movies all become about Wolverine and his amazing friends. And I don't know that that's necessarily the direction they should go in. If we are seeing the X-Men introduced, I would do it one of two ways. I'd either stick with the original team, the original 5 X-Men, and put them against perhaps a foe we haven't seen, or perhaps another version of Magneto's Brotherhood. I think it'd be great if they did the original Brotherhood from the comics. That's going to be tricky since in the MCU, Quicksilver's dead and Scarlet Witch is a member of the Avengers. But they could certainly sub in other members that weren't in that initial lineup. The reason I'd introduce the original Brotherhood of Mutants is Jason Wingard. No one knows who that is. He's this knucklehead called Mastermind in the comics. He has reality warping powers. They're more illusions than actual reality. So for two reasons. The first one is visually that I think would make for an interesting character. The next reason is he has a massive role that he plays in the Dark Phoenix saga. It's a movie Fox tried to make 2 different times. The X-Men cartoon from the 90s actually did a pretty good job of telling that story in an interesting way. That's like the holy grail of comic books. Figuring out how to make a compelling Dark Phoenix movie would be, I think, the biggest thing X-Men could do, but it should come in the future. They shouldn't be rushing into anything. The only other way I'd potentially introduce the X-Men is to jump to the giant-size X-Men team. That idea of an international team of X-Men is good because it brings in diversity, it brings in more interesting characters, and I think you can tell the same stories with that group of characters versus, the original 5 X-Men, including a couple changes in the team. As we kind of move through the MCU, we've established the X-Men, we established the FF. It's inevitable we're going to get Avengers vs. X-Men. I think if they built up to Thanos, the next big build-up should start shortly. I will say it's more than likely you can bet money on us getting an Avengers vs. X-Men movie. It was a widely successful crossover in the comics. Captain America Civil War was one of the higher grossing Marvel movies that pitted heroes against each other, and I think it's repeatedly returned to in the comics, so I expect the movies will follow it in some fashion. So if you want to see more content like this, feel free to subscribe to the channel. If you're looking for more opinions about this kind of stuff, I do a weekly podcast with my co-host, John Clark, every week called Caffeinated Comics. You can find that wherever you find your podcasts. We're on iTunes, Stitcher, Amazon, everyone who's got podcasts. And if you want to follow me on social media, you can find me on Instagram at The Brave Butter Pecan.